Welcome to the Cultivating Leader podcast, a podcast for founders and people leaders who know that culture isn't written in policy. It's felt in every emotion your team experiences at work. I'm Sarah Denner, co-founder of The Cultivators and managing director of New Wave Learning. And in each episode of this podcast, I explore what it really means to be a cultivating leader. You'll hear stories, insights, and practical moves for turning emotion into a strategic lever for performance, loyalty, and growth. I'm excited. So let's get into it. Today, we're diving into something that sits right at the heart of leadership and specifically my personal definition of the cultivating leader. And that thing is trust. And I'm particularly interested in exploring what happens when there is a deficit of it. How often do we think about what trust actually requires from us to be felt by those we need to trust us? Because if we're honest, we have to acknowledge that trust is a feeling. Do I feel that I can trust you? Do you feel like you trust me? Why is that? What is it that makes trust possible? Perhaps you have a strategic goal to be your clients' trusted partners. Perhaps trust is a company value, or it's written in your competency framework. But sadly, so many people still come to work every day not feeling trusted by their leadership or trusting in their leadership or the organisation. That gap, that space between what leaders say they believe in and what people actually feel as a result of their actions and behaviours is where we can examine the trust deficit. But before we do, let's take a look at why trust matters and why it deserves leadership commitment. Gallup's 2024 global research shows that only 1 in 5 employees strongly trust their organisation's leadership. And what surprised me the most about that number is that it has barely moved in a decade. In cultures where trust is low, engagement will eventually fall, productivity will drop, and it's reported in some cases up to 40%, and voluntary turnover doubles. Think about the cost of replacing a high performer. That can be between 80 and 200% of their salary. And that's before we start to count the loss of relationships, knowledge, confidence, and possibly even clients that walk out of the door with them when they leave. So trust isn't a soft, warm or fluffy value or commitment we can take for granted. In my opinion, it's a commercial variable. It's the emotional infrastructure that makes sustained performance and growth possible. I remember working for a senior technical manager for a brief time as part of an overly complicated matrix management structure in my time at IBM. For this manager, their power base was absolutely their knowledge. The trouble was they didn't trust many people with that knowledge. And it meant that, as a team, we kind of formed our own secondary communication network around them so that we could complete our work to the very high standards that this leader set and feel like we were being effective as a team. Sadly, the time and effort it took maintaining this secondary communication network, especially across a global group, meant we were always just a little bit behind on her delivery targets. And whenever this manager spoke to us about this, we never had the confidence to answer her questions because we were never sure that we had all of the knowledge at the time it was needed. Imagine sustaining that feeling, that lack of trust over the long period. Needless to say, it was not a team that I was sad to leave. In a recent workshop that I ran, I opened by showing a video to the participants of a corporate team building event where a group were doing something called a trust fall. I told my group that watching this video would help them with an activity we would be doing later on. Some of them took the bait, I'm pleased to say, and as they watched the individual team members in this video climb the steps up to a platform of 5 wooden pallets high, turn their back to the group waiting to catch them at the bottom, and then fall back, I could sense the nerves in the room that I might be getting them to do this very activity a bit later on. Slowly rise. Now, rest assured, that was not on the agenda. I did want to invoke the fear so that we could talk about a barrier to trust. But I was not going to get them to do the trust fall. As the video came to an end, I didn't have to wait long to come clean, as one of the delegates said to me, "You're not going to make us do that, are you?" in a slightly higher pitched voice than is normal for them. And you could feel the shift in the room. There were a few nervous laughs. Another person kind of crossed their arms and leaned back in their chair, almost in defiance. And that's exactly what I wanted. I never intended anyone to fall. I almost wanted to recreate for them that feeling, the moment just before the fall, that tightening in your chest, the instinct to control what happens next, because that's what fear does. When we fear something, be it a loss, a mistake, a risk, our instinct is to control it. And when control shows up, guess who backs away? Yes, trust. So after a few seconds, I told them, you don't need to fall. The learning's already happening. You could hear the collective exhale. That was my opening to say, trust isn't about removing fear. It's actually about learning to move with it. And leadership is about creating the conditions where that fear feels safe, or, as I often argue, feels brave enough to be able to exist. When I work with founders and small business leaders, what I see most often is this. You've built something from the ground up, you've carried most, if not all, of the risk, and you've probably been let down along the way. You carry the scars and you feel guarded to protect yourself from that ever happening again. You may well have lost time, friends, clients, and probably money and opportunities as a result. So, of course, it makes sense that trusting others feels expensive. But the longer you guard, the more you become the barrier or the brakes to trust existing. Your business stops scaling because people stop trusting you because you don't trust them. Trust isn't soft. It's a strategy for growth and sustainability. And a lack of trust is one of the biggest hidden drains on time, energy, and profit in an SME. Think about how many hours in your week go to checking, approving, or re-explaining something that could have been owned by someone else if clarity and confidence were higher. That's your trust deficit being made visible in your calendar and how you spend your time. I worked with a client recently who runs a virtual assistant connection service. One of her biggest challenges and frustrations with her clients is a lack of trust, particularly if they are new to having a VA in their business. She explained to me that it's a brave move to hire an administrative assistant because it's still perceived as a cost rather than a strategic enabler. However, unless trust can be established quickly, the VA is unlikely to ever meet the high expectations of the guarded founder. The founder, frustrated, terminates the contract quickly and is less likely to trust a future VA in their business again. The loss of opportunity, be it more time for them to work on their business rather than in it, or to take on more clients, or to even have a holiday, is blocked by a willingness to brave the vulnerability of trusting first, so that the VA can do their job, deliver results, and become trusted. Let's look at the commercial reality of trust for a moment. Gallup's data shows that when employees strongly trust leadership, profitability rises by more than 20%. Harvard Business Review's research links high trust cultures to 70% less stress, 50% higher productivity, and significantly lower burnout rates. Those numbers are the difference between a founder who's constantly firefighting and a leader whose business can run and grow without them needing to be everywhere. And it's not just internal. Clients feel trust the same way your team does. When you lead with transparency, clients mirror it with honesty. When you lead with fear or perfectionism, they mirror that too, with distance, delays, and doubt. In smaller teams, trust isn't an abstract principle. It's actually many, many micro moments. It's the conversation after a missed target, the way you respond to a mistake, how you react when someone challenges your idea. Those are the data points that your people collect to decide whether you're safe to be honest with, and therefore decide if you can be trusted. So if you want more accountability in your business from the people that are working in it, start by creating emotional permission for people to tell you the truth. That's what trust feels like in practice. So how do we go about building our own trust system? When I talk about trust with leaders, I use a concept that's been inspired by Brené Brown's jar of marbles, which she talks about in her book, Dare to Lead. At the Cultivators, we call it the trust jar. So imagine a glass jar. This is the space or container that a leader creates and holds for trust to be felt. Inside that jar are a few big rocks. These are the foundations that hold everything steady. Here are a few common examples of big rocks that we often see get named in our workshops. Integrity. Do I do what I said I'd do, even when it's inconvenient? Reliability. Do people know what to expect from me and when they can expect to have it? Boundaries. Do I respect others' boundaries and do I hold my own? Generosity. Do I assume positive intent? So around those big rocks are then small stones. These small stones represent the daily behaviours that either reinforce or potentially over time erode trust. And it might be an unanswered message, a broken promise, or a series of "I'll get back to you," but you never do. Those small stones or moments run the risk of rubbing away the big rocks or creating little chips in the glass jar from the inside. And sometimes the glass does crack. Maybe you overpromised one too many times. Maybe you avoided a hard conversation again. Maybe you were too busy to follow through another time. Reflecting on my own leadership experience, I have many examples of moments that have chipped the trust jar. One that has stuck with me was when I avoided a difficult conversation with an associate about a payment error. Because I didn't have an answer from the bank and I was embarrassed that the invoice hadn't been paid on time, I went underground as far as the associate was concerned. I avoided them. I knew that all I needed was 24 hours to get a reply from the bank and the invoice would be paid. However, I ignored emails and calls and WhatsApp messages from this associate because I was worried about how angry the associate would be, and I didn't have an immediate solution to give them. It worked out, after we had a conversation, that had I just told the truth, they would have stopped worrying about the payment and actually worrying about me, because that was the bigger worry for them. Where had I gone? Why had I gone underground? And they would have been absolutely fine to wait for 24 hours to receive their payment. Repairing those cracks, naming them, apologising, recommitting, that is what turns emotional intelligence into your commercial strength. Because when people see you understand the impact that you've had, you take responsibility, and you try to put it right, their trust in you increases. When we fear losing control, we usually tighten systems instead of strengthening relationships. But clarity in communication creates control far more effectively whilst building trust at the same time. Trust is at the core of what being a cultivating leader means for me. It's why our leadership program kicks off with a module to get into what trust is, what it allows for, the conditions we need to create as leaders for it to be felt, and how we respond to repair and build trust when the cracks in that glass jar, which really represent the fragility of trust, happen. I hope in this podcast you've had an opportunity to reflect on your own approach to trust. Are you waiting for your people to earn your trust? What might trusting them first do for the way they show up for you, your clients, and your business? Or perhaps you've noticed some small chips in your own glass jar, and you're beginning to think about what you might do next to repair those. Thank you for joining me for this conversation on the trust deficit. Thanks so much for listening to the Cultivating Leader podcast. If today's episode has sparked something in you, please share it, tag me, or leave a review. It really helps us to get to more leaders and help them discover the power of emotional culture. To learn more about how we help organisations to build a culture that aligns with their purpose, head to cultivator.co.uk or connect with me on LinkedIn. And remember, if you want your clients to feel X, then your people need to feel your Y. So, what inspired you today to be a cultivating leader? Until the next episode, let's keep culture at the heart of how we lead.